the National Mall in Washington D.C, the sacred heart of the most powerful nation on earth. We've come here to walk this labyrinth from the Lincoln Memorial behind me right down to the Capitol building, about 3 miles in that direction. The labyrinth uncovers the hidden stories that quietly enforce the rules we live by, so that together we can rewrite those rules. And there are stories today, powerful stories in this space, that shape America, who it is, and how it understands its place in the world. We begin at the Lincoln Memorial because in this moment in America's history, the reassertion of the Christian right, the evangelicals who put Trump in the White House, has raised questions about America's relationship to its own religious identity. Abraham Lincoln began the speech that set him on course for the White House with a quote from the Bible, from Mark's Gospel: "A house divided cannot stand." And so with that idea in our minds, we're going to walk the National Mall to uncover the hidden stories of America.
Angel and exile fall into the shadow.
As you walk down here, you're just really aware of just the sheer scale of the Washington Monument. It's just vast. And behind is the Capitol building that kind of emerges over the hill with the Statue of Freedom on top. It's a space that is it's just profound. I feel like it's a genuinely sacred space. It just celebrates these stories about who America is and creates this really profound sense that this is a great and powerful nation. We've come to this precise location just by the Washington Monument because it's right here in a pretty small piece of land relatively to the whole mall that this space reveals itself. It's the only place in this 3-mile stretch that you can see all 5 of the major monuments that frame it at the same time. Right behind me, over the hill, is the very crest of the Capitol building and the statue of Lady Freedom. Through the trees, you can see Jefferson in his great monument. Over on the other side is the White House, and behind us, where we came from, is the Lincoln Memorial, and of course, right here, the Washington Monument. And what you realize that you can't see on a map when you look at this space, but when you stand here, the gaps in the trees reveal this space as a great Latin cross laid out across the whole length of the city. The Capitol right at the foot and its altar facing west with the Lincoln Memorial into the setting sun. This space is like the nave of a great cathedral. The Washington Monument vaulting its frame, its arms spreading north to south and east to west. And so, as we look towards the Lincoln Memorial and those words of Jesus that Lincoln spoke ringing in our ears, "A house divided cannot stand," we wonder, what do these monuments mean? Jefferson is a story of America as liberty. On the walls of his monument are words from the Declaration of Independence. The Capitol and the White House, America as democracy. Lincoln, America as unity. And Washington, the symbol that doesn't leave that much to the imagination, America as military. But this great cathedral, this great house of America that both echoes and shapes the nation, this is a house divided. And here, at the intersection of the cross, it begins to reveal some cracks. Through the trees is Jefferson, author of arguably the most famous words in the world on freedom. But he was a plantation owner who owned slaves. And it was under his presidency that both the White House and the Capitol building used slaves in the laying of their foundations. Washington, the great celebrated military leader that guarantees independence, owned slaves. And it was on the fault line of slavery that the military was divided during the Civil War, and Washington's great federal dream almost torn apart. And so it's important that it is Lincoln who is at the altar of this cathedral. Lincoln, who forged a union. A house divided cannot stand. One of the really interesting things about Mark's story of Jesus in the Bible is the way that he strategically ignores the great monuments and cities of the region where the drama takes place. So most people know Jesus grows up in Nazareth, but Nazareth is a tiny village about an hour's walk from a great capital city called Sepphoris, which was, at the time Jesus was a teenager, the capital of the region. And as a carpenter, he almost certainly worked there as a construction worker. Most of the drama happens around the Sea of Galilee, but Mark never mentions Tiberias, the new capital city established to tax the fishing trade. Jesus goes north to Caesarea Philippi, but only to the villages, never to the city. He travels south and totally ignores Hippus and Scythopolis in the Decapolis, and then arrives at Jericho only to leave again in the same verse. It's hard not to read all this as a snub to the Herodian kings and their Roman overlords. So perhaps there's a way for us to read this space apart from these great monuments and to reimagine what that story of Jesus might mean in this space too. There are around 100 statues of historical figures in Washington D.C, and of that 100, only 5 are of women. I mean, there are loads of statues of mythical creatures, many of them male. Those that are of women tend to be like nymphs and goddesses or abstract virtues like justice or freedom. There are only 5 actual historical women in the capital. The most famous of these lies across the water in a sprawling memorial to her husband. She was the first chairperson of the UN Convention on Human Rights. She was responsible for the authoring of the Declaration on Human Rights. In 1999, Gallup did a survey in the US and found that she was number 9 on the list of most widely respected individuals from the 20th century. And so Eleanor Roosevelt just about makes it into DC with a statue. In 1939, Eleanor Roosevelt found herself in common cause with another woman who doesn't have a statue here, but whose presence here reshaped the meaning of this place perhaps more than any other. Marian Anderson was a world-famous opera singer from the US, and she had played in some of Europe's finest concert halls. But when her manager tried to book the Constitution Hall over there, the Daughters of the American Revolution refused because Marian Anderson was black. Eleanor Roosevelt and thousands of other women resigned their membership in protest, but still no venue could be found. And so Eleanor Roosevelt quietly organised for Marian Anderson to perform outdoors on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. A huge crowd turned out to hear her sing arias and cantatas, but at the end, she finished with the old spiritual, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." and the symbolism of the song of the slaves was not lost. It's generally recognised that up until that moment, the Lincoln Memorial symbolised the struggle to save the Union. But from that moment that Marian Anderson performed, it changed forever into a struggle for emancipation. And so it was for that reason that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference chose the Lincoln Memorial as the site of the 1963 Civil Rights March and Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. Martin Luther King also has a memorial here in Washington, one of the newest memorials, again just over the water near Eleanor Roosevelt. There's something interesting standing in this place about their relationship to the space. As we stand here, they are outside the cathedral. They don't fall within this line of the cross. This is a space that doesn't know what to do with women or people of colour. The African American Museum over there makes the point dramatically. It's kind of forced its way into this landscape in all its incredible difference. There's something about the spatial tension, celebrated but separate, included but other, that reflects some of the ongoing tensions in America today in this divided house.
When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check which has come back marked insufficient funds.
We're standing under the shelter of the amazing African American History and Culture Museum with the Washington Monument ahead of me, this great symbol of America's military. When Jesus comes to Jerusalem, the seventh of the cities in Mark's story, something different happens from those first six. To begin with, he arrives famously on a donkey in this carefully staged piece of street theatre to mock those who believed in this messianic hope that a son of David would arise as king. But then he visits a temple and leaves again in the same verse, like Jericho. But on the second day, he comes back, and there's this strange episode with a fig tree. As he passes by this tree, it's all leaves have blossomed, but there's no fruit. It's not time for fruit, but Jesus goes looking for it anyway, and when he doesn't find any, he curses the tree. And then he goes on into the city, goes to the temple and stages that direct action campaign where he turns over the tables of the money changers as another piece of stage theatre to expose the exploitation of the temple elite. And then the third day, they go back to Jerusalem again and they pass the fig tree and it's withered right down to its roots. And then they go into the temple. Jesus is teaching, challenging the establishment from one angle and another. And as they leave, his disciples say, "Teacher, look what great monuments." And Jesus says, "Not one stone will be left on top of another." Now, trees are very symbolic in first century society in Jesus' day, and fig trees perhaps more than any other. In the prophets, a fig tree in bloom is a sign of messianic promise. A fig tree with fruit is a sign of Yahweh's blessing, but a withered fig tree is a sign of his judgment, normally associated with the exploitation and corruption of the temple. So, the withered fig tree, the direct action campaign in the temple, and the apocalyptic pronunciation that no stone will be left standing, these, in this small story, all amount to the same thing. The house divided cannot stand. Towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King started to make a series of speeches on subjects that were beyond the civil rights issues that he's normally remembered for. He protested passionately against the Vietnam War and joined the anti-poverty cause across all races. He spoke of, in his words, a triple-pronged sickness that has been in our body politic since the beginning: militarism, racism, and excessive materialism. And these sicknesses, these are the sickness of empire. A desire for power and control makes us subjugate others. It leads to militarism. That subjugation of others leads to racism, and their exploitation leads to an excessive materialism. The temple, the great house of Jesus' day, was divided because its allegiance to the empire, to the Roman patrons of Herod the Great, who had it extended in all its glory, was in direct contradiction to its vocation as a house for all nations. And that house divided couldn't stand. In AD 70, the Roman army invaded and razed it to the ground. A house divided cannot stand. And so, in this great house of America, we ask the same question. A house devoted to empire cannot stand, but perhaps a house built with liberty and democracy could endure.
We are now experiencing the coming to the surface of a triple-pronged sickness that has been lurking within our body politic from its very beginning. That is the sickness of racism, excessive materialism, and militarism. Not only is this our nation's dilemma, it is the plague of Western civilization.
I'm fascinated by the ending to Mark's Gospel, because in almost every Bible there'll be a note saying that the original stops at verse 8 and then verses 9 onwards have been added later. So the first ending is that these three women go to the Jesus tomb to anoint his body, Mary, Mary and Salome, and they ask each other, who will roll away the stone, which is perhaps a metaphor for this whole labyrinth. And they get there, they find that the stone's already been rolled away, and there's a young man there who says, Jesus isn't here, he's risen, he's gone ahead of you to Galilee, up in the north. And so they run away from the tomb and they don't say anything to anyone because they're terrified. The end. So you can kind of understand why someone wanted a better ending. So they add all this stuff about then Jesus appeared to all the male disciples and said you can pick up scorpions and drink poison and go into all the earth, basically be victorious. So it seems to me that Mark's Gospel leaves the reader with a choice. Which ending do you want? The ending of vulnerability or the ending of triumph? Right at the end of his life, Martin Luther King was organising another march on Washington, to the Capitol building this time, as part of the Poor People's Campaign. He had taken up the issue of labour conditions across all races. His point was, you can have the vote, but if you don't have the means by which to live, then you still can't participate as a free citizen. But after his assassination, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference persisted anyway, and the Poor People's March arrived on Washington almost 50 years ago to this day, in the spring of 1968. 3,000 of them stayed for 6 weeks in a vast tent encampment on the Mall, known as Resurrection City. And so it seems to me that in that episode, another episode not memorialized by this space, that there is the question raised by the ending of Mark's Gospel. Behind me, up on the hill, the great pillars of the Capitol building. Over on the Mall, the vulnerability of tents, the permanence of pillars versus the transience of tents. So there's a question for us as we walk through this space. Which of those resurrection stories would we choose? And it's a question that invites some careful reflection, because there's a lot to be said for the strength and order of the established base of power, as long as you can get inside. Order is no bad thing, but power tends to corrupt. Down on the rain-soaked Mall, in the swampy encampment, conditions were poor. The Resurrection City was not always a safe place, but it was a place that felt full of a revolutionary promise. So which ending? Which ending to the story? It's a question that still haunts this place today. The ending of Mark's Gospel represents a new beginning. The stone is rolled away, Jesus is off away from the great capital in Jerusalem, back out into the marginal northern lands of Galilee with John the Baptist. And so we're going to end this labyrinth at the beginning in chapter 1. John the Baptist baptizing people in the Jordan River next to the wilderness, living as an indigenous person of the land. And the stories of the indigenous people of this land are most notable here by their almost complete absence. People have lived here for thousands of years in this region of Great Turtle Island before European colonization began. And conservative estimates put the number of indigenous people who died as a direct result of colonization at around 50%. Some estimates are more like 90%. The building behind me is the Museum of the American Indian, and it's one of the few examples of an indigenous presence in the capital. The architecture and design is made to reflect the kind of wild, rocky landscape in which many indigenous tribes have lived. But it seems to me that it's a double-edged sword, because that history of forced subjugation, enslavement, and almost total culture erasure was done on the basis of an idea from European culture of native peoples as almost entirely uncivilized. And it's this endless Greek revivalist Greco-Roman architecture that is everywhere across the city that represents in the Washington imagination the very essence of American civilization. And so in that contrast is a question. Is this a place where you want to be in the center, or is it a place that leads you away to the margins? Do we celebrate the great citadels of stone or the wind-scarred rocks of the caves. We're ending in the beginning of Mark's story of Jesus, where he goes to John the Baptist, who's standing in the flowing rivers of the Jordan, and John forces him down under the water, reenacting this ritual that symbolizes the escape from the empire of Egypt, and then hauling him back out again as a sign of defection from the empire. We reflected on this walk that it is the house devoted to empire that is the house divided. And so the end of Mark is a new beginning and the opportunity for a question. Do we live here in a house divided, or in land beyond her walls? One of the great quirks of history is how the cross on which Jesus was killed became the symbol of the very empire that killed him. After the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, courts across Europe, both Protestant and Catholic, persisted with that same kind of Roman imperial Christianity. And one of the great innovations about America as a nation was the belief that a nation could be founded without that kind of religious imperial rule. And so, as we stand right here at the foot of this vast cross that goes the full 3 miles from the Capitol building right down to the Lincoln Memorial, we ask ourselves the question, to whom does this cross belong? And what does it mean?